to talk fairly briefly about permaculture, not so much details of mulching techniques and gardening, more a global picture about climate change mitigation. I'm just about to share my screen. So I am sharing my screen and I'll start the slideshow and won't keep you waiting any longer. And just checking in with you that all is well. And
That's
you can
great.
see my first slide. Great. Okay, so I'm going to make an assumption that you're aware of permaculture and you know that it's a framework for designing sustainable, I think we need to say regenerative systems. It's known very much for its impact on garden design, but we can design farms with it, we can design villages, we can design publishing companies with it, and charitable educational organisations. It's basically a tool, and as such it's a tool that really has is of its time. I don't need to even really talk about this slide, but just enough to say that current levels of CO2 are absolutely unprecedented in human history, and COVID is really a symptom of ecological decline and perhaps collapse on the globe, rather than, you know, a big surprise. And indeed it was predicted. So here we are in this world. You probably know a little bit about Paul Hawkins' drawdown solutions. They're a useful map. It's really interesting when you look at these 100 CO2 conserving or actually sequestering solutions, because a strong quarter of them are to do with food and land use. And so there's a huge amount that we can affect through how we look after the land and how we design and develop our food systems. And surprisingly less things like, you know, wind turbines are perhaps less impactful than perhaps the technologists would like us to think, and solar farms and so forth, and geothermal. Another very surprising role in solutions is the impact that educating girls around the world has in conserving carbon, because girls, when they are given the freedom to marry older, at an older age, and improve their livelihood, have less children, and so that's a population thing, but it's not a thou shalt not breed edict. It's about recognizing that poverty and early marriage as an economic option is not good for girls, but it's also not good for the planet. And the controversial subject of family planning, controversial I say, because I was at a Commonwealth meeting when Paul posited this as a very strong factor in climate mitigation, to a fairly difficult audience, as many of the countries there were Roman Catholic. But when we combine education and family planning, it actually comes out statistically as the top most effective climate mitigation solution. And you'll see that building materials, transport and other materials are much, much lower. So it's an interesting picture that he draws. One of the main factors in conserving, reducing CO2 in the atmosphere is agriculture. Not just because when we farm regeneratively on smaller lots with mixed silvopasture, so tree systems, as well as grains, we lock up more carbon, but it builds soil biomass. And by building soil biomass, not just thinking about sequestering carbon in trees, we have a real opportunity to use the soil as a huge sponge for CO2, because the oceans, as we know, are totally and utterly saturated by CO2. We can't dump any more in them. Well, what else did Paul come up with? This was very much a collection of scientific data that was gathered by PhD students, postgraduates, lecturers, professors that volunteered for the drawdown programme. Another of his discoveries was that managed grazing, so replicating prairie style grazing where herds are kept tightly together and moved on daily, was seen to be a way of improving soil carbon, and it was the 19th most effective way of storing carbon in the soil and reducing CO2. And he also, as you can see here, projected a net cost for implementing his 100 drawdown solutions. The implementation period is 2030 to 50, and he counted the savings to the planet in dollars, billions or indeed trillions of dollars of savings. Savings probably in the impact of climate chaos. And another advocation of the role of women, this one was the discovery that when women have access to land rather than corporate landholders in developing nations, again, this is a way of drawing down carbon by having smaller scale, relocalized food systems and growing systems, and by increasing silviculture and organic agriculture. And this was also ranked at 42, the 42nd most effective solution out of the 100, with all sorts of net savings. And it was found quite obviously that local communities benefit when women have access to land. Children's nutrition is better, overall health of the village is better, there's a more robust local economic effect in the region, and kids are able to stay at school longer. So there are many, many benefits to this kind of policy. So here are the top 20 solutions as they stand alone. One of them in materials is refrigerant management, so still looking after that ozone layer. And offshore turbines, Boris will be glad to know, is not the one. It's onshore turbines that are the second most effective way of saving energy and moving away from fossil fuels. And then we have reduced food waste, plant-rich diet, and this whole raft of land-based policies. And that interests me because it's not necessarily so much about conservation of resources, it's about dynamic changes in our national and international policies. So I'm just going to move on to a little bit of personal story. So in the early 90s, when I looked out of the back of my rather idyllic looking cottage, this was what I saw. It's a barley field. It looks very pretty, but when we consider the hedgerow that you'll see on one side, when you actually analyse it, it's about a foot higher in terms of soil level than the field. And once you take this crop off, there is absolutely no topsoil whatsoever in it. There was no soil life at all, no worms, no birds feeding on soil life, no insects flying across this field, no bats. It is a desert. And the only way that you can grow stuff on this chalky, flinty subsoil is by chucking on petrochemicals as fertilizers and adding sprays, herbicides. So it's a very, very intensively farmed plot of land, far from its idyllic looks. And within a few years, we transformed it into this. We managed to get our hands on a parcel of it. The landholders had very poor performance from Lloyd's underwriters in the Lloyd's crash in the late 80s, and they had to raise some cash. So we got together with neighbours and managed to buy some plots of land, and we turned it into a permaculture holding. And we worked through the process of restoring it from almost zero biodiversity to an incredibly flourishing plot. This is by about 2008, so it's even better today. If you want to have a look at it, I'll give you a YouTube link where there's a number of tours on YouTube. We planted a wildflower meadow, we restored native fauna, we planted a windbreak, which was totally essential, that was native trees, and then we interplanted a whole variety of edible and useful trees, mostly fruits and nuts, but other varieties as well. And we started a no-dig system. We planted a forest garden. This is the ideal of a forest garden, which is 7 layers. I think personally in this climate, we're better off dealing well with about 3 or 4 layers, because we don't have the light of the subtropical forest gardens that permaculturists in places like Kerala and Australia have. So in the UK, we're a bit more limited and can't grow climbers up trees with such ease. They don't like it and they don't fruit. But we still have the possibility of this very mixed tree and shrub ecology, growing all sorts of perennials mainly. So that's forest gardening, but I really also want to say, people think permaculture is all about food and it's very functional, but for me it's about recreating habitat and creating pest-predator balance. So we grow cranesbill and hawksbit and other loads of lots of oxeye daisies. We keep bees, and we have a really rich flora that then feeds the insects, that feed the birds and the bats, that bring in the amphibians and common lizards in our case on chalk, and create a really fertile and biodiverse ecology that then supports the pest-predator balance on the fruit tree. So we don't get codling moth, and we even we're lucky enough to grow freestanding fig. So on my left-hand side of this picture is a fig that was happily freestanding and fruiting this summer. We were making jam and drying figs. We had so many. And we grow all sorts of other things that you would expect, pears and golden gages and all sorts of climbing and hybrid berries. So we're trying to, in essence, populate every niche that we can in the canopy with flowering and useful foods and plants. It's another one. So it's quite wild at some times of the year. At the moment, all the meadow is scythed and cut, and it's all looking quite neat and tidy. It gets wilder depending on different times of the year, and all the fruit is designed, particularly the apples, to fruit sequentially from earlies, mids to late. And we don't have to just grow apples and pears and plums and all the lovely English crops, British crops that are commonly grown here. We can grow things like Szechuan and Nepalese pepper, and this is Nepalese pepper. It's one of our favourite crops of the year. It's got a gorgeous smell. We use it in our cooking all of the time. You can see some nuts in that picture too that come from the garden. And we don't just grow trees in a big space. We have a fairly compact, no-dig raised bed vegetable patch, and we're growing stuff 12 months of the year in there. And then a small greenhouse, it's just 10 by 6 max, and that's got espaliered fruit tree. We grow indoor peaches in there. We take in our tender plants like physalis and protect them in there. And then we take them outside in the summer and they fruit. And of course we grow tomatoes and basils and chilies and all the things that you would expect in a greenhouse in the UK. So we don't have a polytunnel. We grow perennials. So on my left-hand side is perennial kale, which is a great cropper. And yeah, I mean, a real mix of annuals and perennials. So what do we do when we scale this up? Because we can scale our garden right down to the smallish handkerchief and just take the essence of what we like to grow and grow it in a small space. But what happens climatically to the soil, and what happens economically when we scale this up? So this is a really useful example. This is Le Ferme de Bec du Halouin, and this is a holding in France. It's 20 acres, or hectares, beg your pardon, so double that in acreage. But only 1 hectare is intensively managed with raised beds and hugelkultures and polytunnels and companion polycultures, all those lovely permaculture garden systems that you'll hear about. And the rest, the other 49 hectares, is just not intensively cultivated. So perceived wisdom in France is that one single farmer to make a living needs 120 hectares, but Le Bec as a market garden supports 3 livelihoods on just 1 acre intensively grown. So you can see how much we can grow in small gardens and how much we can grow potentially in cities to relocalize our food systems and eliminate, you know, the massive scale of transportation and food waste. What's really interesting about Le Bec is that it is these mixed systems, and that they've done a lot of, they've had the Institute Silva come in and the University of Liège from Belgium, and they've measured the soil carbon levels. Now, the perceived wisdom is that, so the French National Institute for Agricultural Research says we need to increase our soil carbon by 4 tons per cultivated hectare per year. And this is like the golden climate stabilization statistic. If we can increase by 4 tons per hectare per annum our global organic stock, so all our farmed land on the planet, we would stabilize CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. We wouldn't reduce them, but we'd stabilize them. So it would be a huge start. So they did some research into the forest garden, and this is an example of a forest garden area. And they found that the forest garden exceeded in soil carbon 4 tons per hectare, which is, sorry, it was, the soil carbon was 7 times the target of that 4 tons per hectare. They thought, well, okay, that's reasonable. That's, you know, systems that are about trees, you know, that's intercropping with trees, so we can understand and expect that. This is an example of their mounded hugelkulture beds. That's, you can see it's interplanted with fruit trees. They tested the soil carbon here, and that is 13 times exceeds the 4 tons per hectare soil carbon levels. And that is pretty much mainly annual cropping. So quite hard, quite worked. Here's another picture of their annual type beds with heavy mulches. I don't recommend straw for us. I think we're too wet. It's a dry climate in Normandy. But This is the bio-intensive market garden under glass area, and you'd think, oh well, you know, they're ripping out crops on a regular basis and having to replace the compost systems. That isn't going to be a good carbon sink, but in fact the increase was 26 times level of soil carbon than compared to 4 tonnes per acre. So what does this mean? Well, it means that we can definitively capture capture CO2 in soil and biomass with regenerative farming methods, and we can increase employment on land and reduce greenhouse gases, and we can relocalise a lot of our agriculture. We do not need these massive industrial farms and the chemicals that have to be used, the machinery for cultivation. And we can do it bio-intensively on a fraction of the land. Obviously, we can't grow grain for bread, but you know, we're looking at so much of our agriculture is based on this intensive method. Looking around me, where I live in Hampshire, I'm just seeing fields and fields and fields of crops that are grown to feed livestock, not people. So I'm advocating a huge scaling up of this kind of regenerative methodology. And part of my work, as you mentioned in the introduction, is with Common Earth. I'm a trustee of this organisation that's working with the 54 Commonwealth nations to identify best practice projects that can pass on and share climatically appropriate responses to develop better ecological systems, effective yields for farms, better local economic systems, and better systems for people. So I just want to take you on a little tiny trip, knowing my time is limited, to Belize in the Caribbean, and into a place that is 40 years ago was an absolutely degenerated, eroded citrus and cattle farm up in the Mayan mountains. It is now a really biodiverse food forest. They grow all sorts of food here. It was bought in 1988 by someone called Christopher Nesbitt, and as I said, it was absolutely exhausted. Now it's a very complex stacked polyculture. His main interest is growing food timbers and medicinals and marketing crops, growing crops for market. So this is pineapple, and they grow coffee beans. This is a indigenous medicinal plant known to the Mayans. Doesn't have a European name, but it's for stomach upsets. They grow loads of cacao, plantain, papaya. I mean, it really is coffee. Coffee's a cash crop, but coffee's likes growing underneath the canopy. It doesn't like being in monocultures, so that's what they do. And they have a great crop. They grow plantain, all sorts of different crops, including timber for construction, some to sell and some to use on the farm. And they build all sorts of structures. This is a timber that's used for boat masts, and Chris always says if he needs a hip replacement, this is what's going to pay for it, because he doesn't obviously have an NHS. And I just thought I'd show you a couple of beautiful slides of the kind of biodiversity in this place. It's got jaguars, and this is a Jesus Christ lizard because it has the capacity to walk across water. Lovely frog, beautiful birds of paradise. Just a lovely place. Lots of scorpions, of course. And this is an example of a very simple accommodation that is hurricane proof. The window closes onto corrugated iron, and it's a very robust structure because this place is right in the middle of the Caribbean and the hurricane zone. So this is Chris's wife. Oh, sorry, Selene Logan. And she's an advocate, works a lot with young women, developing alternative economic yields for them, so that they're not forced into the cities or into very, very early marriage. So, you know, learning how to make products for market stalls and create small income. This is Mr. Gonzalez. He's Chris's gold standard food forest teacher, a Mayan person, a Mayan neighbour that taught Chris, really, he says, all he needed to know about how to grow this incredible array of crops in this naturalised system that also creates habitat in the rainforest. And Chris himself. So, to probably come to an end now, so there's time for you. Another option is this idea of marine permaculture, where Brian von Hersen, I'm sure you may have heard of him, is looking at systems for reversing desertification in our oceans, which are absolutely saturated by carbon dioxide and rapidly acidifying, so that over 90% of the heat from global warming is actually absorbed in the oceans, and the effect is it's creating ocean deserts. And the key technology is called marine permaculture arrays. These are lightweight latticed structures, about 1/2 mile in size. They're submerged 80 feet below sea level to avoid the shipping lanes in extreme weather, and then kelp's attached to them and it grows downwards. And these latticed structures rise and fall with pumps that are powered by the waves, and the pumps bring up colder water, which is nutrient rich, to the surface, and they pump down colder water to the warmer water to the depths that is not conducive to life, so lacks plankton. So in a way, they're like a micro Gulf Stream, moving the hotter water downwards and the cooler water upwards, and it has the most incredible effect. The kelp, of course, is a food source. It's a fibre. It can be used as an animal feed. It can be made into organic fertilizers. It can become a biofuel. But what's most important about this system is it creates habitat. And I just wanted to end by reading you a quote. So they put one of these systems in, and this is what Brian said. Within 57 hours after deployment, the system sparked plankton growth. Shortly thereafter, these blooms attracted various species of fish. 2 weeks later, a 17-foot, 5-meter long whale shark was found circling the area, feeding on plankton that had started to bloom. So very, very fast, of effective, powerful way of regenerating oceans whilst providing food and other yields in a permaculture system. I think this is just the tip of the iceberg of what's possible. I really think we could regenerate the earth, create habitat and ecosystems, not be so greedy with our land grab, live in a smaller space, and share this planet more equitably with our other species. So we have all sorts of resources to finish. We have free ebooks on our website. Here's a link here. Free posts on our daily website as well. I mentioned our lovely YouTube channel where you can come and have a look at our garden in full bloom as it was this year during lockdowns, and find out a bit more about what we're growing and how we grow it. And yeah, my request to you, thank you very much for listening, and please do stay in touch with us and send us your news and your ideas. So thanks very much for listening. I shall release the screen share.
Right. Thanks so much for that, Maddy. I say on behalf of everyone, thank you for that talk. It was really inspiring and really hopeful, actually. I'm going to dive straight into some of the questions. That's all right with you?
Absolutely. Your time now, not mine.
Okay, first question is from Marie Amelie. Is intensive agriculture also about requiring less labour? How labour intensive is permaculture on a large scale? And I think this links into Sue's question, which is, have you managed to persuade any of your neighbouring Hampshire farmers to change their practices? Is it viable on a large scale?
Well, most large scale monocropping is mechanised, and therefore it is what you spend on machines, you don't spend on people, and you spend on transportation by selling your crops internationally. So it's a completely different model. Have we persuaded any of our local landowners? We have, over time, worked very hard with a couple of local farmers. One was an organic farmer anyway, so he has had, an insight into what we've been talking about. The other one was conventional farmer, who's now one of a group of what they call conservation farmers. So their funding comes through the creation of habitat. And I think that kind of policy post-Brexit is going to increase. But in the UK, we still are way, way behind on regenerative farming. There are regenerative larger scale farms in the UK, but there aren't enough yet. There's more in Australia.
And do you do any outreach work with your organisations in order to get farmers to change their practices?
Well, I'm the editor of Permaculture magazine, so and I publish books on permaculture and regenerative practices. So my outreach is very much defined as a publisher rather than a farm advisor. But I have sat last year on the parliamentary subcommittee looking at regenerative agriculture as one of their advisors, and I spoke at Oxford Rural Farming Conference. So through different more targeted organisations and the Land Workers Alliance, yes, there is a sharing of information and an attempt to influence policy at Westminster and share information and build networks with farmers. We're not interested in farmer bashing. We just want to try and get this message across about biodiversity and carbon sequestration and yields. And when you look at France, there's far more funding for silviculture, for example, and far more understanding of the science. We are very, very stuck in our post-war dig up everything and plant potatoes, because we're type of, let's have a monocrop. Let's fund. Well, you're the Green Party. That the agricultural policies benefit large landowners. They don't benefit biodiversity and smaller holdings. And that's something that we've been trying to lobby against.
Okay, thank you. And I think I have time for one more short question before we go into breakout rooms. I've got one from Edred, which is, many people who dismiss the merits of a plant-based diet claim that we need manure from livestock or other wild animals to maintain topsoil health. Is this true?
Well, you see, what it says about the in Drawdown, he's very careful the way they express that. They're saying a plant-based diet, and by a plant-based diet, they're not saying exclusively vegan or exclusively vegetarian. They're saying a plant-based diet, so a diet that's predominantly plants, and that's their position. And I think from the science that I am seeing, there is a place for animals in our landscape, domesticated animals, not just wild animals, but under very stringent conditions, not under, the factory farms are abhorrent and disgusting and vile and highly polluting of the air and water courses. So I'm not an advocate in any way, but I do have an understanding and an open mind that not everyone is going to give up eating animals overnight, and that we need to, in many traditional cultures, like in India, pasture, livestock is central to village life, particularly cattle. So we need to look at pasture-fed livestock systems and holistic planned grazing, as well as vegetable crops, plant-based crops. Controversial.
It is.
Very.
Something for the breakout rooms, I think.
Oh yeah.
And on that note, I'll end the Q&A there. Thank you for everyone who put questions in. Sorry we didn't get a chance to go through all of them.